The air in Boston clung to everything. The soot to the brick buildings, the salt to the docks, and the dull, grinding certainty of his future to Silas Thorne's soul. At 23, Silas was already a master apprentice in the Thorne & Sons Clockworks, a respected establishment that had measured the steady, predictable march of time for 2 generations of Boston's elite. The shop was a symphony of precision, the rhythmic tick-tock of dozens of mechanisms, the high-pitched whir of a lathe, the precise click of a lever falling into place. It was a life built on order, on predictable movements, on the assurance that every second would follow the last exactly as it should. And it was driving Silas mad. His father, stern and immutably set in the ways of New England propriety, saw Silas as a continuation, not an individual. "A man finds his freedom in his craft, Silas," he would say, peering over his spectacles while meticulously filing a brass gear. And a good Thorne never fails to keep time. But Silas felt like a clock whose spring was overwound, its pendulum violently swinging off-center. He looked at the endless, cobbled streets of the city, not with appreciation for their history, but with a sense of being perpetually boxed in. He saw the horizon not as the end of the Atlantic, but as the beginning of a vast, unknown space that the city's meticulously kept clocks could not measure. His discontent was a quiet hum, a vibration that only he felt, like a subtle imperfection in a perfect mechanism. It manifested in small rebellions. While his father drafted financial ledgers, Silas was sketching maps. Not of Boston, but of places with impossible names. The Black Hills, the Great Salt Lake, the Yellowstone. Places where the time was not kept by polished brass and steel, but by the movement of the sun and the flow of mighty rivers. One cold evening in October of 1849, the quiet hum of his dissatisfaction suddenly became a shout. He was working late, assembling a grand mahogany grandfather clock, a wedding gift for a prominent merchant. As he set the final weight, the clock let out a deep, resonant gong marking midnight. Silas stood back, admiring the flawless execution of his labor. It was beautiful, it was valuable, and it was utterly meaningless to him. He picked up a discarded newspaper, one that his father had used to wrap a spare part. The headline, printed in bold, crude type, was months old, but it hit him like a fresh wave. Gold. A river of fortune in California. Silas knew the tales were exaggerated, that the journey was brutal, and that the vast majority of men who went west found only hardship and ruin. Yet as he read the feverish account of the 49ers, a different kind of calculation began in his mind. Not the precise, rational math of the clockworks, but the wild, irrational arithmetic of destiny. It wasn't the gold that called to him. It was the space. The idea that one could walk for days and still be surrounded only by the untamed earth, where a man's worth was measured not by his inheritance or his trade, but by his endurance and his wits. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. The decision, though terrifying, felt immediately and profoundly right. It was as if every ticking moment of his life had been building to this singular choice to abandon the tick-tock entirely. His opportunity came a week later. A local carriage manufacturer, a Mr. Hawthorne, was seeking a man with mechanical skill to accompany a shipment of specialized tools and parts to St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis, the gateway to the West. The final staging ground for every great expedition was 1,000 miles closer to the unwritten frontier. Silas presented the proposition to his father with uncharacteristic firmness. "It's a business opportunity, Father. We can establish a contact for our precision tools. Mr. Hawthorne assures me the market is growing." His father regarded him with a skeptical, narrow-eyed gaze, one that seemed to dissect Silas as if he were a faulty mechanism. "St. Louis? That lawless, fever-ridden collection of shacks? You have a future here, Silas, a legacy. Why risk it for an unproven market?" "A legacy is not the same as a life, Father," Silas replied, the words catching in his throat. He had never spoken so plainly, so disrespectfully. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the incessant ticking of the clocks. "Very well," his father finally conceded, his voice brittle. "You will go and you will return. You will deliver the goods, secure the contact, and be back within 6 months, or you need not bother crossing the threshold of Thorn & Sons again." He did not issue a threat. He simply stated an immutable fact of their world. Silas nodded, a rush of cold exhilaration running through him. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he would never return to the Clockworks. He spent the next 2 days liquidating his small inheritance, a few gold coins, a small piece of land his mother had left him. He kept a few essential clockmaker's tools, a notebook and a sturdy compass, the tools of his past now pressed into the service of his future. The only other item he packed with care was a small, leather-bound volume of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays, a quiet companion to his burgeoning transcendentalist impulse to break free and be one with nature. The carriage to St. Louis was cramped, smelling of oiled leather and damp wool. His fellow travelers were mostly merchants and a family of determined, quiet immigrants. The journey was a gradual shedding of the old world. The perfect paved roads gave way to rutted dirt tracks. The neat white churches were replaced by rough-hewn log cabins, and the precise timekeeping of Boston was replaced by the chaotic rhythm of the road. The creak of the wagon wheels, the snort of the horses in the endless, flat horizon. Silas found himself staring out the window, mesmerized by the subtle transformation. The trees grew taller, the sky seemed wider, and the people they met were different. Louder, rougher, more open in their ambitions and their desperation. He started keeping a new kind of journal. Not a detailed record of hours and minutes, but a log of observations. October 30th, crossing Pennsylvania. The silence here is not the polite silence of a workshop. It is the deep, hungry silence of the earth. I hear my own thoughts clearly for the first time. November 7th, Ohio River crossing. Saw a man selling hand-drawn maps of the territory. He was a charlatan, surely, but his lines and scribbles held more truth than any polished timekeeper in Boston. They described possibility, not certainty. When they reached St. Louis, the city was a violent explosion of activity. It wasn't clean or orderly like Boston. It was loud, dirty, and alive. The docks were choked with flatboats and steam packets. The streets were a swirling chaos of European immigrants, rough trappers in buckskin, army surveyors, and merchants hawking everything from flour to forged picks. Silas delivered the tools to Mr. Hawthorne's contact, secured the proper receipts, and then promptly bought a ticket for a westward-bound wagon train. The train, a sprawling collection of families and solitary adventurers, was scheduled to leave in 3 days, heading toward Independence, Missouri, the true starting point of the Oregon and California trails. The contact, a portly, sweating man named Mr. Finch, looked at Silas's ticket with bewildered disapproval. "You're a Thorn, aren't you? From the clock people. You're supposed to be securing a supply line, son, not becoming the merchandise." "I've secured the business, sir," Silas said, carefully avoiding a lie. "I'm simply extending my survey to the potential consumer base." Mr. Finch grunted, unconvinced, but handed Silas the small packet of money for his services. It was enough. In the remaining time, Silas equipped himself like a true traveler. He traded his finely tailored Boston coat for a heavy canvas jacket. He bought a good, solid revolver, a necessity, he was told, and more importantly, a sturdy, well-fed mule named Jasper. He provisioned Jasper with bags of dried beans, salt pork, and hard biscuits. On the third morning, as the sun burned the damp mist off the Mississippi, Silas stood on the edge of the city looking west. The air was colder, cleaner and carried no smell of salt or soot, only the earthy promise of the plains. He pulled the small, precious compass from his pack. Its needle, made of the finest steel and perfectly calibrated in the Thorn and Sons workshop, trembled slightly before settling on west. He had spent his life making things that kept time. Now he was finally ready to live a life that defied it. He placed his hand on the mule's rough neck. "Well, Jasper," he murmured, the words feeling foreign and exhilarating. "The West whispers, and we are finally listening." With a deep breath, he stepped onto the trail that led out of St. Louis, leaving the world of predictable ticks and tocks behind him, trading the certainty of a golden inheritance for the vast, terrifying possibility of the open, unwritten frontier. The call to a new life was no longer a whisper. It was the thunder of his own heart. The first week on the trail, heading southwest toward the assembly point in Independence, was a brutal tutorial in humility. Silas Thorne, the master apprentice who could fix any clock in Boston, could barely manage a mule. Jasper was stubborn. The leather harness chafed, and the dust, thick and incessant, coated his lungs and his carefully preserved belongings. He rode mostly alone, a small figure swallowed by the gradually opening landscape. Yet he was not escaping the incessant company of the one thing he truly wanted to leave behind: memory. The past didn't come in flashes of vivid horror. It came in the quiet, methodical ticking of his mind, like an internal clock that refused to stop. Every time his hands were idle, the familiar, suffocating image would return: the cool, pale blue of his mother's favorite silk dress, the way the light fell on the floor of the parlor, and the shattering, echoing silence after the physician delivered the verdict. Silas had been 12. His mother, Clara, had always been fragile, a delicate flower in the robust, unyielding atmosphere of the Thorne household. His father had insisted that she needed routine, order, and discipline to thrive. She had been sickly, yes, but her heart had truly failed the day his father installed the magnificent grandfather clock in the parlor. Now, "Clara," his father had declared with finality, "you have no excuse. This clock is the master. It dictates our meals, our rest, and our work. Order is life." Clara had tried. She had attempted to sync her fading health to the relentless gong of the timepiece, but the steady, predictable tick-tock seemed to mock her fragile existence. Silas remembered the day vividly, her attempt to host a dinner party, her face flushed with fever and exhaustion, forcing a smile when the clock struck 7. He had begged her to rest. He had tried to sabotage the clock, nudging the pendulum slightly, hoping to make it lose a few hours, just long enough for her to sleep. But his father had noticed the error, reprimanded Silas severely for his amateurish negligence, and meticulously corrected the mechanism. An hour later, as the clock struck 8, Clara Thorne had collapsed in the parlor, her hand outstretched as if trying to push away the massive, unfeeling wood and brass. The physician had offered a simple, clinical explanation: a weak heart, a rapid decline. But Silas, standing over her body, had seen only one culprit: the cold, relentless precision of the clock, the relentless expectation of time. The guilt was the brass weight pulling his own life downward. He too was a clockmaker. He had inherited the skill, the precise hand, the logical mind of his father. Every beautiful mechanism he crafted, every piece of order he imposed on the chaos of springs and gears, felt like a silent, horrifying pact with the very force that had consumed his mother. He was haunted by the fact that he was so good at creating the instruments of rigid, unyielding order. That was the shadow of the old world he carried. It wasn't just his father's expectations. It was the internalized belief that order led to death, that freedom lay only in unmeasurable chaos. One afternoon, a torrential late autumn rain began, turning the dirt track into a sucking brown quagmire. Silas and Jasper were forced to take shelter under a dilapidated, abandoned lean-to on the edge of a barren field. The rain lashed down, blurring the horizon and silencing the world. It was a perfect moment for the memory to return, vivid and cruel. Silas sat in the mud, staring at his hands, the hands that could make the most intricate gears, the hands that could have stopped that clock. A gruff voice cut through the memory. "You look like a man who just lost his last dollar, boy. Though by the look of your clothes you didn't start with many." Silas looked up. Standing in the mouth of the lean-to was an imposing figure. A man perhaps 50 years old, built like an oak barrel, with a face weathered by sun and wind into a tapestry of deep lines. He was dressed in worn buckskin and carried a long, antique rifle with the casual intimacy of a walking stick. "I have my resources, sir," Silas replied, trying to sound authoritative. The man chuckled, a rough, dry sound. "Resources are what's in your head, not your pocket, out here. Name's Elijah Cole, and you've got a look about you. A look of a man running from something that ain't behind him." Silas felt a flush of heat rise to his neck. He quickly checked the bindings on his mule's pack. "I am simply embarking on a new venture, Mr. Cole. The frontier offers opportunity." Elijah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "Opportunity is chasing something. Running is different. Where you running from, city boy? Debt, a woman, or something that lives inside your own head?" Silas, unused to such blunt, invasive honesty, instinctively grabbed the wooden box containing his most precious tools, his clockmaker's kit. "I'm leaving Boston." It was a place of too much precision, too much time kept. Elijah's sharp blue eyes settled on the box. "Ah, precision. You a surveyor? Or a doctor?" "A clockmaker," Silas admitted, hating the small, proud ring the word still carried. "Or I was." Elijah threw his head back and let out a bellowing laugh. "A clockmaker. Headin' west. Well, that takes the cake. Son, there ain't no time out there. Just distance. And the difference between sunrise and sunset. You'll find no parlor clocks on the Oregon Trail." Elijah's words were a revelation. No time, just distance. This was the final break with the past Silas had been seeking. The West wasn't just a place to strike gold. It was a vast, lawless expanse where his skill, the symbol of his inherited guilt, was utterly meaningless. He could finally be a man defined not by the minutes he counted, but by the ground he covered. "Then I am in the right place," Silas said, the conviction settling deep in his chest. Elijah seemed to recognize the shift in the young man's posture. He didn't mock him again, but simply nodded toward the muddy trail. "I'm heading to Independence. Meeting a train there. If you know how to mend a broken wagon axle as well as a broken spring, you can ride alongside me. I could use a lookout that can read the sky better than the bottom of a whiskey glass." Silas accepted the offer instantly. Elijah Cole was a man of the West, a link to the chaos and freedom he craved. The next 2 days, riding alongside Elijah, were filled with lessons. Elijah taught him how to set a snare, how to read the clouds for a coming storm, and most importantly, how to distinguish between a trail and a wish. He spoke little of his own past, but his silences were easy. Unlike the strained silence between Silas and his father, Silas, encouraged by Elijah's lack of judgment, finally articulated the core of his restlessness, though he did not mention his mother's death directly. In Boston, Mr. Cole, every moment was accounted for. Every minute was a brick laid in a wall. I felt like I was being walled in, suffocating under the weight of a future that had already been determined for me. Elijah listened, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "That ain't just Boston, son. That's the nature of settled men. They trade the wildness of life for the security of routine. They measure everything and call it wisdom." He turned to Silas, his expression suddenly serious. "But you ought to know one thing. The West has its own kind of time. It's not a measured time. It's a brutal time. The sun will burn you in minutes and the blizzard will freeze you in hours. Out here you don't run from the clock. You run from the natural world, which is a far harsher master than your old man. Elijah's honesty was a cold compress on Silas's fevered imagination. He wasn't running to a paradise of unconstrained freedom. He was running to a different kind of discipline, one that demanded acute alertness, not merely skillful execution. As they finally approached the outskirts of Independence, the sheer scale of the preparation for the westward migration was astounding. Hundreds of wagons were gathered, forming a temporary, chaotic town of canvas and iron. The air buzzed with the sound of hammers, the shouts of teamsters, and the bleating of livestock. Silas dismounted Jasper. He opened his clockmaker's kit, a small, polished wooden box that felt completely out of place against the rough-hewn backdrop. He pulled out his most prized possession, a tiny, exquisitely made, gold-plated mainspring, the heart of a timepiece. He held it up to the setting sun. It glittered, a perfect testament to the order and genius of the world he was leaving. It was a beautiful, terrible thing, with a profound sense of closure, a gesture that spoke louder than any argument with his father. Silas took the mainspring and threw it with all his strength into the dense, muddy undergrowth bordering the camp. It was a small act, unnoticed by the surging crowds, but to Silas it was the definitive final break with the past. He was no longer a clockmaker running from a city. He was a man standing on the edge of the world, having symbolically buried the instrument of his guilt and the embodiment of his trauma. He turned to Elijah, the dust and the setting sun making his face look older, harder. "What's the first thing I need to know about the trail?" Elijah grinned, a gap-toothed, genuine smile that crinkled the corner of his eyes. "The first thing, Silas Thorne, is that the trail don't care who your daddy was. Now let's find a spot to camp. We start tomorrow, and tomorrow is a mighty long day." Silas nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. Not the gentle easing of comfort, but the powerful, cleansing force of a dam finally breaking. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and followed Elijah into the heart of the chaotic camp. A man who had traded the tyranny of time for the terrifying, hopeful freedom of distance. "It seems you are ready for the third major section of your historical story." The morning the wagon train rolled out of Independence was less an orderly departure and more a roaring, frantic birth. 300 souls, 72 canvas-hooded wagons, 200 oxen, and a herd of loose cattle and sheep surged westward, churning the earth into a thick, clay-colored broth. Silas, riding his mule Jasper next to Elijah Cole's covered wagon, felt a dizzying mix of panic and profound liberation. The noise was deafening. The groan of wagon wheels, the cracking of whips, the shouts of teamsters, and the constant rhythmic hup, hup, urging the oxen forward. This was the true beginning. The moment the map in his head became the arduous, physical reality beneath his feet. Elijah, who had secured a position as an experienced scout for the large company, was completely in his element. He rode slightly ahead, his ancient rifle resting easy in its saddle sheath, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "Keep your head up, Thorne," Elijah roared back, his voice cutting through the din. "We're past the fences now. The air smells different out here, and you better learn to read what it's telling you." Silas tried to focus on the trail, but the sheer volume of human endeavor was overwhelming. He quickly learned that the first physical trial of the Oregon Trail was not starvation or natives, but chaos. Wagons broke axles in the ruts. Greenhorn drivers panicked and overturned their loads. And the ever-present dust, kicked up by thousands of hooves and dozens of wheels, was a fine, choking powder that settled everywhere in his teeth, his clothes, and it felt deep into his spirit. For the first few days, the landscape was forgiving, rolling green hills and familiar stands of timber. But as they pressed on, crossing into what the maps called the territory, the land began its gradual, inexorable transformation. The trees thinned out, the hills flattened into vast, sweeping plains, and the sky became a dome so immense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. Silas, raised in the tight canyons of Boston streets, found the endless, unbroken vista terrifying. There was no shelter, no corner to turn, no building to offer perspective. His internal sense of space and distance, calibrated by years of measuring tiny gears, was completely useless. He felt insignificant, a speck of grit in an enormous, indifferent machine. His second physical trial arrived with the Kansas River crossing. It had rained heavily the night before, turning the river into a muddy, swollen torrent. The established ferry was barely functional, and waiting for it would cost the train days. The decision was made to ford. The scene was pure mayhem. Oxen panicked in the cold water. Wagons, not sealed properly, took on water and began to float precariously. People screamed instructions and prayers simultaneously. Silas, having never swum anything deeper than a tidal cove, was assigned to a rope crew, pulling on a thick hawser meant to stabilize a large freight wagon. He planted his city boots in the slick mud of the bank and strained against the immense weight. The rope went taut, cutting into his shoulder. The wagon lurched, and the lead ox, spooked by a sudden submerged log, tried to turn back. The driver cursed and whipped the beast. The sudden jerk pulled the rope from the hands of the man next to Silas, and the full strain hit Silas. His feet slipped. The mud gave way, and he tumbled into the icy brown water. The rope still looped around his arm. The current immediately seized him, pulling him toward the deeper channel. The noise faded into a muffled roar, and all he could see was the churning, opaque brown water and the frantic shadow of the wagon wheels above him. Panic, cold, visceral, and instant, choked his throat. "This is it," a voice whispered in his mind. "Your grand adventure ends here, drowned in the mud, far from any clock that could measure your final minutes." It was the same feeling of helpless panic he'd felt that day in the parlor, watching his mother struggle, unable to stop the cruel, inevitable mechanism of her decline. He was frozen, not by the cold, but by the memory of futility. Suddenly, a massive hand grabbed the collar of his jacket and hauled. Elijah Cole, his face a mask of furious determination, had secured a line around a tree root and lunged into the shallows. "You're on the plains now, Thorne. Fight the time," Elijah bellowed, pulling him with surprising strength toward the bank. Silas, spluttering and coughing, was dragged onto the mud. He lay there, shivering, watching the wagon successfully pulled across. He was soaked, his breath ragged and his pride utterly shattered. "You froze," Elijah said, not with malice but with a flat observation as he wrung water from his own beard. "You stared at the river like it was going to tell you the time of your death." Silas could only nod, his teeth chattering. "Well, it won't," Elijah stated, securing Jasper's tether. "Out here, the time is now. If you freeze up in the face of a river, what'll you do when you face the emptiness of the plains? That'll test your spirit more than any water crossing." The emptiness was Silas's third and most enduring physical trial. Once the wagons cleared the river and the rolling hills gave way entirely, they entered the true Great Plains, a monotonous sea of tall grasses that stretched unbroken to the ends of the earth. The trail followed the Little Blue River, a ribbon of life in the vast dryness, and the days fell into a grueling, unchanging rhythm. Sunrise, the call of the guard, the lowing of cattle, the hurried, cold breakfast of hardtack and beans. Morning, the slow, relentless march, 10 to 12 miles of pushing through the heat and dust. Noon, a brief, shaded rest. The sun an inescapable hammer. Afternoon, the punishing continuation of the march, often slowed by deep sand or swarms of biting flies. Sunset, the chaotic process of corralling the wagons into a defensive circle, the smell of wood smoke and sweat, and the exhaustion that settled bone deep. Silas's body, unused to sustained labor, ached everywhere. His hands, once delicate instruments of precision, were now calloused and blistered from handling rope and mule. The sun burned his fair skin and the alkaline dust cracked his lips. He suffered from debilitating headaches, the result of the ceaseless vibrating motion of the trail. He started to understand the deep, profound difference between order and discipline. In Boston, order was imposed externally by the clock and his father. Out here, discipline was a voluntary, internal choice made minute by grinding minute, just to survive the elements. One night, sitting by the meager fire, rubbing salve onto his cracked hands, he pulled out his notebook. He hadn't written in days. There was no energy for reflection, but the memory of Elijah's words spurred him on. Fight the time. He opened the book and began to write, not an observation, but a confession, May 14th, 1850, somewhere on the Little Blue. I used to believe that my freedom lay in escaping time, that if I ran far enough from the clockworks, I would escape the guilt of my mother's death, the guilt that I was part of the unforgiving order that consumed her. But the West has no clocks, and I am still measured. I am measured by the pain in my legs, by the clarity of my sight, by my ability to find water, and by the sheer animal will to get up tomorrow and face the same horizon. The prairie is not chaos. It is an indifferent, perfect mechanism of its own. It is a clock built of miles and sun, and if I am to survive, I must stop seeing myself as the broken son of a clockmaker and start seeing myself as the raw material that the prairie intends to shape. I have failed every trial so far. I have panicked in the water. I have succumbed to the fatigue of the distance. My old skills are useless. I cannot mend a man's future with a gold-plated spring. I can only walk. He looked at his hands, no longer seeing them as the hands of Thorn and Sons, but as instruments of simple, enduring locomotion. As the weeks bled into one another, Silas began to learn. He learned the silent language of Jasper, whose ears could detect an anomaly in the wind miles away. He learned how to save his canteen water, rationing it not by the hour but by the next expected spring. He learned to sleep through the noise of the oxen and the cries of the restless children. He was still slow, still prone to mistakes, but he was no longer freezing. He was moving. He was enduring. He had traded the precise, terrifying order of the clock for the brutal, simple necessity of the trail. The Great Divide was not just a geographic border. It was the chasm between the man he was and the man the West was demanding him to become. One evening, as the wagon train paused for a necessary repair, Elijah found Silas trying to resecure a loosened wheel on his own small wagon. Silas was covered in grease and dust, struggling with a massive wrench. "You'll strip the thread, boy," Elijah commented, walking over. Silas dropped the wrench in frustration. "The threads are too fine. They need a tool I don't have." Elijah picked up the wrench, applied a single, practiced movement, and the nut seated perfectly. He handed the wrench back. "The West doesn't need your fine tools, Silas. It needs men who know when to use force and when to use patience. You're learning. Slowly." Silas looked at the fixed wheel, then at the vast, intimidating horizon. He hadn't found gold or fortune or even true peace. He had found a harsh, unblinking mirror that showed him exactly who he was. A fragile man on a great journey. And for the first time since leaving Boston, that simple, unavoidable truth felt like a solid foundation, not a sentence. He was across the Great Divide. The easy part was over, and the only way forward was to keep walking. 2 months into the journey, the wagon train had settled into a grim, efficient existence. They had passed Fort Kearny and were now following the broad, shallow sweep of the Platte River, the main artery of the westward migration. The landscape had transformed again, becoming drier, the sagebrush replacing the lush prairie grass. The monotony was a constant psychological battering ram, but it was the people who truly strained Silas Thorne's endurance. The company of settlers was a microcosm of American ambition, rife with the very social prejudices and hierarchies Silas had hoped to leave in Boston. There was Mr. Silas Finch, the merchant who saw the trail only as a market to exploit, the tightly knit German families who kept entirely to themselves, and the dozen or so solitary men, prospectors and wanderers, whose intentions were as opaque as the river mud. The captain of the train, a stern elected man named Mr. Harrington, enforced a rigid military-like order, but under the canvas hoods the real currency was distrust. Everyone guarded their supplies, eyed their neighbors' mules, and whispered about those whose pace was too slow or whose motives seemed too keen. Silas, riding beside Elijah Cole, was an object of particular suspicion. He was an outsider, a gentleman with soft hands who claimed to be heading for California yet carried no mining gear. He was an enigma, and on the trail, enigmas were risks. "They look at you, city boy, and they see fresh meat," Elijah commented one evening, sharpening his hunting knife. "You don't look like you've earned the dust on your boots yet. And out here, if you haven't earned it, they'll try to steal it one way or another." The first true conflict arose not from outside but from within the train itself, centered on the most precious commodity, water. They hit a dry stretch where the Platte receded dramatically. The rationing became severe, enforced by armed guards. One morning, a scrawny, desperate man named Thomas, whose pregnant wife was ailing, was caught dipping an extra bucket from the communal barrel. Captain Harrington was unyielding. "The rules are clear. Stealing water is stealing life." He ordered Thomas to be tied to the wagon wheel for 2 hours in the relentless midday sun. It was a harsh, inhumane punishment, designed to break the man and enforce the rule. Silas watched the scene with cold revulsion. This was the dark heart of the order his father had prized. Rules followed blindly, without compassion. Yet he said nothing. He was just a passenger trying to survive. Elijah, however, stepped forward. "Harrington, that's a fever punishment. You'll kill him before noon." "He threatened the whole company, Cole," Harrington snapped. Elijah pointed to the suffering man. "He threatened starvation. You're threatening murder. Out here we need the measure of a man's strength, not the measure of his obedience. Let him go and give him water after he swears to uphold the guard watch for the rest of the week." The two men stood in a tense, dusty standoff. The train held its breath. Elijah, with his bulk and the silent authority of true wilderness experience, held the moral high ground. Harrington conceded, releasing the man but adding a heavy penalty of extra labor. Later, Silas sought out Elijah. "Why did you intervene?" Elijah shrugged. "The prairie kills enough of us. We don't need to help it. But more than that, Thomas is a fool, but he's not a snake. You keep an eye on the snakes, Thorne. The ones who look like saints and act like vultures." The snakes arrived 2 days later in the form of a small, heavily armed group of men on horseback. They were not part of any recognized train and carried no families or possessions, only rifles and a grim, territorial air. Their leader was a tall, scarred man named Kessler. Kessler and his men camped close to the train one evening, their presence immediately poisoning the air. They were hunters, they claimed, but their eyes were fixed on the train's oxen and the women, not the buffalo. That night, one of the German families reported 2 of their prize oxen missing. Captain Harrington, fearing a direct conflict that would leave his train vulnerable, accused the first person he saw, a quiet elderly prospector named Old Man Giles, known for wandering away from camp to pan for stray gold. Kessler and his men watched the proceedings with predatory interest. Elijah and Silas were detailed to track the missing oxen. They found the tracks not heading toward the river, but looping back toward the trail they had just covered. Elijah examined the prints carefully. "These ain't the tracks of a man panicking," Elijah muttered, pointing to a subtle drag mark. "They're the tracks of a man leading the beast slowly, deliberately. And look there." He pointed to a distinct new boot print overlaying the cattle prints. It was a distinctive, expensive boot, not the worn leather of old man Giles. Silas recognized the boot print instantly. It belonged to Marcus Vane, a wealthy, arrogant young man who had joined the train late, claiming to be seeking a gentleman's adventure, but who spent his days boasting of his inheritance and his superiority over the common settlers. Vane was Elijah's snake, the one who looked respectable but carried poison. They tracked the oxen and Vane through a ravine where Vane was attempting to butcher the animals for their meat and hides, intending to claim the carcasses were found stray. The ensuing confrontation was fast and ugly. When Vane saw them, he panicked, drawing a small pearl-handled pistol. "Stand down, Vane," Elijah commanded, raising his rifle halfway. "We know they're Harrington's oxen. Now you'll tie up the hides and walk back with us." Vane, cornered and desperate, fired wildly. The shot went wide, kicking up dust between Silas and Elijah. It was Silas who moved first, relying on an instinct he didn't know he possessed. He grabbed a heavy stone, the kind used to chalk the wagon wheels, and hurled it. The stone caught Vane's arm, knocking the pistol into the mud. Elijah was on him instantly, wrenching Vane's arms behind his back. As they dragged Vane and the butchered oxen back to camp, they passed Kessler's band, who were leaning on their saddles watching. Kessler gave Silas a long, calculating look, a silent assessment of the city boy who had found the courage to fight. Harrington, humiliated to discover the thief was one of the train's respectable members, was forced to confront the depth of the internal corruption. Vane was expelled from the train, a virtual death sentence on the plains, and the incident became a crucible, marking Silas as one of Elijah's men, a status that offered both protection and new enemies. He was still slow, still prone to mistakes, but he was no longer freezing. He was moving. He was enduring. He had traded the precise, terrifying order of the clock for the brutal, simple necessity of the trail. The Great Divide was not just a geographic border. It was the chasm between the man he was and the man the West was demanding him to become. One evening, as the wagon train paused for a necessary repair, Elijah found Silas trying to resecure a loosened wheel on his own small wagon. Silas was covered in grease and dust, struggling with a massive wrench. "You'll strip the thread, boy," Elijah commented, walking over. Silas dropped the wrench in frustration. "The threads are too fine. They need a tool I don't have." Elijah picked up the wrench, applied a single, practiced movement, and the nut seated perfectly. He handed the wrench back. "The West doesn't need your fine tools, Silas. It needs men who know when to use force and when to use patience. You're learning. Slowly." Silas looked at the fixed wheel, then at the vast, intimidating horizon. He hadn't found gold or fortune or even true peace. He had found a harsh, unblinking mirror that showed him exactly who he was. A fragile man on a great journey. And for the first time since leaving Boston, that simple, unavoidable truth felt like a solid foundation, not a sentence. He was across the Great Divide. The easy part was over, and the only way forward was to keep walking. 2 months into the journey, the wagon train had settled into a grim, efficient existence. They had passed Fort Kearny and were now following the broad, shallow sweep of the Platte River, the main artery of the westward migration. The landscape had transformed again, becoming drier, the sagebrush replacing the lush prairie grass. The monotony was a constant psychological battering ram, but it was the people who truly strained Silas Thorne's endurance. The company of settlers was a microcosm of American ambition, rife with the very social prejudices and hierarchies Silas had hoped to leave in Boston. There was Mr. Silas Finch, the merchant who saw the trail only as a market to exploit, the tightly knit German families who kept entirely to themselves, and the dozen or so solitary men, prospectors and wanderers, whose intentions were as opaque as the river mud. The captain of the train, a stern elected man named Mr. Harrington, enforced a rigid military-like order, but under the canvas hoods the real currency was distrust. Everyone guarded their supplies, eyed their neighbors' mules, and whispered about those whose pace was too slow or whose motives seemed too keen. Silas, riding beside Elijah Cole, was an object of particular suspicion. He was an outsider, a gentleman with soft hands who claimed to be heading for California yet carried no mining gear. He was an enigma, and on the trail, enigmas were risks. "They look at you, city boy, and they see fresh meat," Elijah commented one evening, sharpening his hunting knife. "You don't look like you've earned the dust on your boots yet. And out here, if you haven't earned it, they'll try to steal it one way or another." The first true conflict arose not from outside but from within the train itself, centered on the most precious commodity, water. They hit a dry stretch where the Platte receded dramatically. The rationing became severe, enforced by armed guards. One morning, a scrawny, desperate man named Thomas, whose pregnant wife was ailing, was caught dipping an extra bucket from the communal barrel. Captain Harrington was unyielding. "The rules are clear. Stealing water is stealing life." He ordered Thomas to be tied to the wagon wheel for 2 hours in the relentless midday sun. It was a harsh, inhumane punishment, designed to break the man and enforce the rule. Silas watched the scene with cold revulsion. This was the dark heart of the order his father had prized. Rules followed blindly, without compassion. Yet he said nothing. He was just a passenger trying to survive. Elijah, however, stepped forward. "Harrington, that's a fever punishment. You'll kill him before noon." "He threatened the whole company, Cole," Harrington snapped. Elijah pointed to the suffering man. "He threatened starvation. You're threatening murder. Out here we need the measure of a man's strength, not the measure of his obedience. Let him go and give him water after he swears to uphold the guard watch for the rest of the week." The two men stood in a tense, dusty standoff. The train held its breath. Elijah, with his bulk and the silent authority of true wilderness experience, held the moral high ground. Harrington conceded, releasing the man but adding a heavy penalty of extra labor. Later, Silas sought out Elijah. "Why did you intervene?" Elijah shrugged. "The prairie kills enough of us. We don't need to help it. But more than that, Thomas is a fool, but he's not a snake. You keep an eye on the snakes, Thorne. The ones who look like saints and act like vultures." The snakes arrived 2 days later in the form of a small, heavily armed group of men on horseback. They were not part of any recognized train and carried no families or possessions, only rifles and a grim, territorial air. Their leader was a tall, scarred man named Kessler. Kessler and his men camped close to the train one evening, their presence immediately poisoning the air. They were hunters, they claimed, but their eyes were fixed on the train's oxen and the women, not the buffalo. That night, one of the German families reported 2 of their prize oxen missing. Captain Harrington, fearing a direct conflict that would leave his train vulnerable, accused the first person he saw, a quiet elderly prospector named Old Man Giles, known for wandering away from camp to pan for stray gold. Kessler and his men watched the proceedings with predatory interest. Elijah and Silas were detailed to track the missing oxen. They found the tracks not heading toward the river, but looping back toward the trail they had just covered. Elijah examined the prints carefully. "These ain't the tracks of a man panicking," Elijah muttered, pointing to a subtle drag mark. They're the tracks of a man leading the beasts slowly, deliberately. And look there. He pointed to a distinct new boot print overlaying the cattle prints. It was a distinctive, expensive boot, not the worn leather of old man Giles. Silas recognized the boot print instantly. It belonged to Marcus Vane, a wealthy, arrogant young man who had joined the train late, claiming to be seeking a gentleman's adventure, but who spent his days boasting of his inheritance and his superiority over the common settlers. Vane was Elijah's snake, the one who looked respectable but carried poison. They tracked the oxen and Vane through a ravine where Vane was attempting to butcher the animals for their meat and hides, intending to claim the carcasses were found stray. The ensuing confrontation was fast and ugly. When Vane saw them, he panicked, drawing a small pearl-handled pistol. "Stand down, Vane," Elijah commanded, raising his rifle halfway. "We know they're Harrington's oxen. Now you'll tie up the hides and walk back with us." Vane, cornered and desperate, fired wildly. The shot went wide, kicking up dust between Silas and Elijah. It was Silas who moved first, relying on an instinct he didn't know he possessed. He grabbed a heavy stone, the kind used to chalk the wagon wheels, and hurled it. The stone caught Vane's arm, knocking the pistol into the mud. Elijah was on him instantly, wrenching Vane's arms behind his back. As they dragged Vane and the butchered oxen back to camp, they passed Kessler's band, who were leaning on their saddles watching. Kessler gave Silas a long, calculating look, a silent assessment of the city boy who had found the courage to fight. Harrington, humiliated to discover the thief was one of the train's respectable members, was forced to confront the depth of the internal corruption. Vane was expelled from the train, a virtual death sentence on the plains, and the incident became a crucible, marking Silas as one of Elijah's men, a status that offered both protection and new enemies. The most defining encounter, however, occurred as they neared the South Platte crossing. They were following a wide, natural track that skirted a series of low bluffs. Elijah, riding ahead with Silas, suddenly raised his hand, halting the main column. Silas saw them then. 3 men, far from the wagon train, sitting silently on horseback on the crest of a bluff, watching. They were Lakota, their posture one of quiet, formidable patience, their clothing and manner utterly alien to the settlers. A wave of palpable fear and immediate distrust swept through the wagon train. Guns were drawn. Women pulled children into the wagons. This was the savage menace the newspapers back east had warned against, the unpredictable enemy of civilization. Captain Harrington rode forward, his face pale but determined. "Colt, negotiate. Tell them we mean no harm, we just want to pass. Offer them a sack of flour." Elijah dismounted slowly, handing his rifle to Silas. "No, Captain. Don't rush the talk, and don't offer food first. That makes us beggars or fools." Elijah walked toward the Lakota unarmed, slowly raising his hand in a gesture of peace, palm outward. Silas watched, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hand gripping Elijah's rifle, feeling the immense responsibility of his trust. The Lakota leader, a man with fierce, intelligent eyes, watched Elijah's approach. Elijah spoke a few slow, guttural words in a trade language, a mix of Lakota and Cheyenne that Silas couldn't understand. The conversation was slow, deliberate, and entirely centered on territory and passage. Silas watched the subtle shift in their posture, the rigid tension easing slightly, but the alertness never fading. After 15 minutes that felt like hours, Elijah returned, his face unreadable. "They are the Oglala," Elijah said quietly to Harrington. "They ask why we are trampling their hunting grounds. I told them we seek only the gold fields, that we are driven by hunger for shining rocks and will not stay." "And they accepted that?" Harrington asked, incredulous. "They accepted the terms of passage," Elijah corrected. They demand a toll, not flour, but iron. They need steel for tools, for arrowheads, for scrap. We leave 300 pounds of bar iron and 2 good axes at the bluff, and they allow us 3 days to cross their territory without trouble. Harrington was furious. 300 pounds of iron. That's a king's ransom. It's the price of a life, Captain, Elijah countered, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces of the settlers. Pay it or face a different toll. The settlers grudgingly contributed the iron, a heavy price in a land where supplies were everything. As the train moved on, the tension was thick. Many whispered that Elijah had simply given their supplies to the savages out of fear or, worse, sympathy. Silas, however, saw the encounter differently. He realized that the Lakota did not operate on the rules of distrust but on the rules of territory. They had an order, a system of survival, that was completely separate from the clocks and contracts of Boston, or the petty greed of the wagon train. Their order was about the health of the land, and the passage price was a matter of resource management, not robbery. The greatest challenge of the trail was not the physical hardship, but the moral ambiguity. The dust and distrust was everywhere. He distrusted the rigid, inhumane order of the captain. The captain distrusted the wild, unpredictable wisdom of Elijah. The settlers distrusted the quiet, territorial right of the Lakota. Silas realized he still distrusted his own judgment, the judgment of a man who had tried to run from his past, only to find that the same patterns of greed, rules, and fear dominated the unwritten frontier. That evening, as the train successfully passed the invisible boundary, and the 3 Lakota figures remained silhouetted on the distant bluff, Silas sat alone cleaning Elijah's rifle. They could have ambushed us, Silas said, testing the weight of the statement. Elijah, chewing slowly on a piece of jerky, nodded. Of course. But they don't fight for greed, Thorne. They fight for ground. They saw you. The clockmaker's son who threw a rock to defend another man's oxen. They saw Vane, the thief. They saw Harrington, the fool. And they saw me. They measure a man by his actions on their ground, not by his money or his words. Silas ran his hand over the cold, familiar steel of the rifle barrel. It was the antithesis of a clock, a machine designed for sudden, violent finality, not for steady, measured movement. He had started the journey running from the certainty of time, but he was learning that the American West, the Great Divide, demanded a new kind of certainty, the certainty of action and the brutal recognition of consequence. The dust settled on everything, on the rich, the poor, the honest, and the thief, and in this great dusty equalizer, Silas was finally beginning to understand the real stakes of his new life. He was no longer just running from Boston. He was learning how to fight for his survival on the vast, morally complex stage of the American West. It is time for a pivotal moment in Silas Thorne's journey. This section will establish the driving commitment that will shape the rest of your story. You are asking me to write a 3,500-word story in English based on the subtitle, The Price of a Promise, focusing on a commitment made that defines the narrative arc, a debt or oath. I will continue the narrative from the last point, where Silas has just navigated the initial challenges of the trail and the complexities of human interaction, and now faces a crisis that forces him to make a binding commitment. The price of a promise. The trail had become a schoolhouse for Silas Thorne, teaching lessons written in dust, sweat, and alkali. He had mastered the rhythmic sway of Jasper, the mute language of the oxen, and the necessity of keeping his own counsel. Yet the vast, empty beauty of the plains often made the internal conflicts of the wagon train feel petty and exhausting. It was in the desolate, monotonous miles between the South Platte and the eventual crossing of the North Platte that fate intervened, not with the grand spectacle of a natural disaster, but with the subtle, insidious cruelty of illness, a sickness, a brutal, Rapid dysentery, often known as mountain fever, began to sweep through the crowded train. It showed no respect for wealth, piety, or discipline, striking the weak and the strong alike. The measured daily progress of the train slowed to a crawl, punctuated by hurried roadside burials and the terrible, constant sound of coughing. Captain Harrington, rigid and rule-bound, quickly lost control. Fear and paranoia were better motivators than any whip. Families isolated themselves. Supplies, especially medicine, became impossible to barter for. It was during this crisis that Silas's old, precise skills found an unexpected new use. The fever didn't yield to his knowledge of clock mechanics, but order did. He found himself helping the train's sole overwhelmed physician, a tired, stoic woman named Dr. Eleanor Vance. Silas didn't know medicine, but he knew how to manage resources, how to keep meticulous records, and how to sterilize with alcohol and heat. He organized the makeshift infirmary tent, allocating boiled water and scarce opium tinctures with the precision he once used for regulating escapements. One evening, Dr. Vance, utterly spent, leaned against the wagon wheel, watching Silas meticulously clean a tin surgical kit. "You're a clockmaker, Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her voice raw. "You should be mending watches, not fevered souls." "A mechanism is a mechanism, Doctor," Silas replied, not looking up. "And this one is running terribly fast. I am just trying to slow the escapement." Dr. Vance smiled faintly. "No, Silas, clocks are about predicting the future. People are about accepting the chaos of the present. You were meant to run away from time, and here you are desperately trying to manage what little time these folks have left." The sickness had a cruel logic. It struck the vulnerable, and among the hardest hit were the German immigrant families, the ones who kept strictly to themselves, their language and culture isolating them further. In particular, a family named Krieger, a father, mother, and their 10-year-old daughter, Elsa, were devastated. The parents succumbed quickly, leaving Elsa an orphan in the middle of the Great Plains. Silas had grown fond of Elsa during his rounds. She was a quiet, observant girl with startlingly blue eyes. She didn't cry for her parents. She just sat silently, holding a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Her silence was louder than any wail. The wagon train's reaction was brutally practical. No one wanted to take on the burden of a fever-ridden, non-English-speaking orphan. Captain Harrington declared that the child would have to be left with the last family that could spare resources, or, more likely, placed with the next military detachment heading east, effectively abandoning her. That night, Elijah Cole found Silas sitting alone by the Krieger wagon, guarding the sleeping Elsa. "You can't take her, Thorne," Elijah said gently, breaking a long silence. "She's a commitment that'll sink your California dream. She's a mouth to feed, a person to protect, and she'll slow you down." Silas looked down at the sleeping girl. He saw not a burden, but a piece of the chaos that he was finally ready to face. He saw the opposite of the cold, unfeeling mechanism that had defined his youth. Elsa was fragile, unpredictable, and entirely dependent on a decision based on compassion, not calculation. "My mother was left alone, Elijah," Silas said, the memory of his 12-year-old self returning with a crushing weight. Not in a fever tent, but in her own home, trapped by a life that was too rigid for her to bear. I froze then. I couldn't stop the clock. But this time, this is a person. She needs a future, not an ordered past. He ran his hand over the wooden bird clutched in Elsa's tiny hand. "If I leave her, I am no better than my father. I am choosing the certainty of my own success over the duty of a human life. I am choosing the clock again." Elijah watched him, his weathered face softened by the firelight. "You'll be giving up the gold, Silas. You'll be trading freedom for responsibility. Then let the gold be the price of the promise," Silas declared, the words an oath whispered to the vast, indifferent prairie. He felt a profound sense of settling, the internal mechanism finally finding its true alignment. He stood up, his posture straighter than it had ever been. I will take her to Oregon. The letters of her parents mentioned a cousin in the Willamette Valley. They were not seeking gold. They were seeking a home. I will see her safely there. I will deliver her to kin. This was the commitment that defined the narrative arc. He was abandoning the gold rush, California, for the responsibility of guiding Elsa to a permanent settlement, Oregon. His journey was no longer about escape. It was about delivery. Elijah nodded slowly, a look of grudging respect in his eyes. Oregon it is, then. That means breaking from this train in 3 weeks at the Great Forks. It means facing the Northern Trail, the one with fewer people and more dangers. We'll need a new wagon and more salt pork. The next few weeks were a desperate scramble. Silas liquidated his remaining small assets, his few gold coins and some of his finer, more portable clockmaking tools. He traded these treasures, symbols of his past, for a sturdy, smaller hand-me-down wagon and enough provisions to last 3 months. He had enough to get himself to California, but now he had enough to get them to Oregon. Captain Harrington was furious. You are abandoning the company. You are taking valuable resources. Silas faced him down, no longer the timid Bostonian. I am delivering on a promise made to the deceased, Captain. You may keep your order. I choose my duty. The price of the promise immediately became apparent. First, there was Marcus Vane's revenge. Vane, the arrogant thief Silas had exposed, had been lingering in the shadows of the train's slow progress. The night before Silas, Elijah, and Elsa were to separate from the main train, Vane and 2 rough-looking allies attempted to sabotage Silas's new wagon, slashing the canvas cover and scattering a barrel of flour into the dirt. Elijah, whose watchfulness was relentless, caught them in the act. The fight was brutal, silent, and swift. Elijah, relying on sheer strength and years of rough living, disabled one man instantly. Silas, however, faced Vane, who was now desperate and armed with a knife. Silas fought not with skill, but with the raw protective fury of his new duty. Vane lunged. Silas blocked with a heavy wagon spoke, the one he had chosen specifically for its balance. He didn't aim to wound. He aimed to neutralize the threat. He struck Vane hard in the shoulder, knocking him down. You want my gold, Vane? Silas hissed, standing over him covered in flour and sweat. I have none. I traded it all for a promise. And that promise is guarded by steel. They chased Vane and his men off, leaving them wounded but alive. The incident left a deep, cold certainty in Silas. The trail was a zero-sum game, and his oath had made him a target. The final break came on a bright, cold morning at the Great Forks of the Platte River. The larger train turned southwest toward the gold rush. Silas, Elijah, and Elsa turned northwest toward the distant, green Willamette Valley. As the noise of the main train faded, leaving only the immense silence of the northern plains, Silas looked at Elsa, who was riding silently in the small wagon, clutching her wooden bird. Oregon is a long way, Elsa, he said gently in English, knowing she understood more than she let on. Elsa simply nodded, looking out at the immense, terrifying space. She spoke only one word in a quiet, firm German accent. Forward. Silas took a deep breath. He had traded the measured predictability of his past for the dangerous certainty of his future. His compass, the perfect instrument of his old life, now pointed toward a destination dictated not by ambition, but by honor. He had paid the price of the promise, and the cost was his own carefully planned freedom. Now he would see the bargain through, one grueling mile at a time. The real journey, the journey of redemption, had finally begun. It's time for the next significant challenge in Silas Thorne's journey. You are asking me to write a 3,500-word story in English based on the subtitle, Winter's Harsh Hand, focusing on a moment of severe hardship or setback, testing the protagonist's resolve. Based on the preceding narrative, Silas, Elijah, and the young orphan Elsa have broken off from the main gold rush train and are now heading northwest toward Oregon. This section will introduce a major environmental setback, the early onset of winter, that puts Silas's commitment to the ultimate test. I will begin writing the story now, focusing on the brutal reality of the Northern Oregon Trail, winter's harsh hand. The Northern Trail, often called the Cutoff, lived up to Elijah Cole's dire predictions. It was a route of harsh solitude and stunning, desolate beauty. Where the California Trail had offered the dubious comfort of crowds, the Oregon route offered only distance. Silas, Elijah, and Elsa traveled mostly alone, relying solely on Elijah's deep knowledge of the land and Silas's meticulous rationing of their dwindling supplies. The weeks after the Great Forks passed in a blur of increasing effort. They crossed the dusty high plains, pushed through the first treacherous river fords, and began the long ascent toward the Rocky Mountains. Silas had gained muscle and lost his city softness, but his true test arrived not in a flash of danger but in a gradual, inexorable descent into cold. It was barely late September, but the high altitudes, combined with an unseasonal shift in weather, brought winter howling down the mountain slopes weeks too early. The first snowfall was thin, a dusting that looked romantic and innocent. By the third day, however, they were caught in a brutal, blinding blizzard. The gentle white flakes became horizontal knives of ice, and the temperature plummeted to a deadly freeze. "This is the mountain's curse, Silas," Elijah rasped, his breath misting thickly in the frigid air. "We should have been past this divide before the cold set in. We are 2 weeks too late." The immediate challenge was survival. The small hand-me-down wagon Silas had purchased was insufficient shelter. The canvas, thin and brittle with cold, flapped uselessly against the gale. The slow, rhythmic pace of their journey was replaced by a desperate, stumbling search for refuge. They managed to find a shallow cave tucked into a rocky outcrop, just large enough for the three of them and the mule, Jasper. The wagon, abandoned to the relentless snowdrift outside, was already becoming entombed. Inside the cave, the severity of their setback became chillingly clear. Their provisions, carefully calculated for a longer, milder autumn, were suddenly inadequate for a sustained siege. They had food for perhaps 10 days, but the storm showed no sign of breaking. Worse, the constant, damp cold had permeated everything. Elsa began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that struck fear into Silas's heart. Silas, the former clockmaker obsessed with time, was now engaged in a fierce, immediate war against it. He spent every waking minute guarding their small, sputtering fire, feeding it precious, damp wood that Elijah had scavenged just before the blizzard hit. The cold was a constant, physical torment, a relentless pressure that squeezed the life out of everything. Silas's hands, the once prized instruments of his trade, were now cracked and swollen with frostbite. He could barely feel the rough axe handle, let alone the delicate tools of his former life. It was during the 4th day of the storm, when the fear had settled into a dull, heavy ache, that the first true tragedy struck. Jasper the mule fell ill. The mule, already weakened by the early high-altitude climbs, had struggled to find enough forage. The intense cold pushed him over the edge. He collapsed, unable to stand, his breath shallow and labored. Jasper was their engine. Without him, their small wagon, loaded with the essentials of life and the fragile hope of Oregon, was useless. The journey was officially and irrevocably stopped. Elijah, his face grim, checked the mule's eyes and sighed. "He's done, son. He won't last the night. And if he goes, we lose the bulk of our food and the only means of transport. It is the mountain's price." The loss was more than practical. It was a psychological hammer blow. Silas had invested his final resources, his final hopes into this animal. He felt a wave of crushing despair, a terrifying replay of the futility he had felt in Boston. He had tried to be a man of action, a man of compassion and the cold. Indifferent West had struck him down with the same merciless logic as the clock had struck down his mother. He stared at the collapsed animal, then at the small, shivering form of Elsa, her cough tearing at the silence. The memory of his solemn oath, "I will deliver her to kin," felt like a joke played by the cruel wilderness. Why not eat the food and use the mule's carcass, leave the girl, and save yourself? The thought, cold and poisonous, slipped into his mind. It is the practical thing to do. It is the way of the frontier. You have done your best. No one would blame you. Silas instinctively went to his pack and pulled out the only remaining connection to his past, his small, heavy leather-bound copy of Emerson. He hadn't read it in months. He opened it looking for a sign, a moral compass point. He read a single, underlined sentence. A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within. The gleam of light was not a philosophy. It was a memory of Dr. Vance's exhausted, truthful face, of Elijah's gruff protective authority, and of Elsa's small determined whisper, "Forward." His duty was not an external rule like his father's clocks. It was an internal resolve, a promise made to himself that superseded the laws of the trail. He made his decision. "We won't leave the food, Elijah," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. "We use Jasper's carcass for meat and hide. We will need the protein to survive until the storm breaks. But we will not leave the wagon." Elijah looked at him, surprised. "Without the mule, that wagon is dead weight, Silas. We can't pull that load through a foot of snow on our own. We take the packs and walk out?" "No," Silas insisted, kneeling beside the wagon wheel. "We take the wagon, or at least pieces of it. It's too large to pull, but we can disassemble it. The wheels are too heavy, but the axles, the bed, the yoke, they can be broken down and lashed into sledges. We won't be fast, but we will carry everything we need. The iron, the dried food, the blankets, and the girl." He pointed to his clockmaker's kit, which he had fiercely guarded through all his travels. "I may not be able to fix the mule, but I know how to break down a strong wooden mechanism and rebuild it into something new. That wagon is wood and iron. It is not an end. It is a resource." This was the final critical transformation of Silas Thorne. He was no longer the man who built things to keep time, nor the man who simply rejected time. He was a man who saw the world as a practical collection of materials. A man who could take the tools and skills of his old world and press them into the desperate service of the new. With a silent, shared determination, Silas and Elijah performed the heartbreaking duty of putting down Jasper. The mule's sacrifice immediately became their lifeline. They worked through the night, using their knives and the few tools they had, butchering the carcass for meat and carefully curing the hide inside the cave, using the heat of the fire. Then, for 3 long grinding days, they worked on the wagon, the blizzard howling outside. Silas, with his precise knowledge of stress points and leverage, directed the dismantling. Elijah provided the brute strength. They discarded the heavy wheels and the canvas but saved the sturdy, treated floorboards, the iron fittings, and the essential foodstuffs. They used the heavy, smooth axles and crosspieces to create 2 rough, deep runner sledges. They lashed their supplies onto one and constructed a secure, blanket-lined space for Elsa on the other. When the storm finally broke on the 7th day, the world outside the cave was a blinding, pristine expanse of white. The snow lay deep, making the air impossibly cold but still. Silas stepped out, pulling the rope harness of the first sledge over his shoulder. The weight was immense, a constant dragging force that demanded every ounce of his newfound physical strength. Elijah helped Elsa into the second sledge, tucking her carefully under a thick buffalo robe salvaged from their dwindling supplies. "We walk slow," Silas, Elijah warned, his breath pluming white. "Maybe 4 miles a day." "It is a crawl." "It is forward," Silas replied, echoing Elsa's simple, powerful word. They began the crawl. Silas walked first, his head bowed against the wind, his body now an engine of raw, painful commitment. Every pull, every agonizing step through the deep, crystallized snow was a victory over the temptation of despair and the lure of self-preservation. He was no longer fleeing the shadow of his past. He was actively redeeming it. The commitment he had made to Elsa, the price of the promise, had forced him to transform his very essence. As they moved across the silent, unforgiving whiteness, Silas looked back at the shallow cave where Jasper lay buried, and where his own easy life had finally died. The winter's harsh hand had taken his comfort, his hope for speed, and his belief in an easy redemption. But in return it had forged a new man, a man defined not by the gentle ticking of a clock, but by the relentless, hard-won progress of his own 2 feet. The great divide was behind them. The true test of the Oregon Trail, the test of endurance and faith in an internal moral code, had just begun. The descent from the high Rockies was a study in prolonged, aching fatigue. For 3 weeks, Silas and Elijah had been beasts of burden, pulling the 2 rough sledges through melting snow and treacherous frozen mud. Their progress was measured in feet, not miles. Silas's hands were a ruin of chilblains and raw sores, and Elijah's gruff endurance had been stretched thin. But as the elevation dropped, the air grew softer, the days lengthened, and the snow finally gave way to sodden, dark earth. The silence of the deep winter began to recede, replaced by the faint, blessed sound of rushing water and the rustle of pine needles. One late afternoon, just as Silas thought his legs might give way forever, Elijah stopped abruptly. "Smell that, boy?" Elijah's voice was hoarse but laced with triumph. Silas sniffed the cold air. It wasn't the scent of pine or damp earth. It was wood smoke mixed with something else. Bacon and brewing coffee. "Fort Laramie," Elijah announced, pulling his worn hat lower over his eyes. "A few weeks behind schedule, but we made it." The last true glimpse of order before the final push to the coast. The sight of the fort was a powerful emotional shock. It was a cluster of rough-hewn log structures surrounded by a protective palisade, not the grand, measured architecture of Boston, but a structure of absolute, undeniable certainty. It represented safety, resources, and, momentarily, an end to the brutal immediate war for survival. Elsa, who had been silent for days, sat up in her sledge, her blue eyes wide. She reached out a small hand as if to touch the smoke rising from the chimneys. The fort was a frenzy of activity, a temporary civilization built on the backs of commerce and desperation. It housed not only a contingent of U.S. soldiers and a trade post run by the American Fur Company, but also a teeming, chaotic overflow of late-season pioneers, weary trappers, and a few enterprising merchants. Their arrival was met with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Silas and Elijah, gaunt and filthy, pulling sledges with a silent, pale child, were a testament to the hardship of the early trail. Silas's first actions were pragmatic, securing a warm corner in the crowded common barracks for the night, finding fresh water and inspecting Elsa. Dr. Vance's care, combined with the mild climate change, had arrested the worst of Elsa's fever, but she was desperately thin. His second necessity was to resupply. Their food was nearly gone, and the heavy iron fittings, the remnants of his old wagon, needed to be traded. The trade post was run by a shrewd, wiry man named Mr. Gaines, who measured every piece of bartered iron with a skeptical eye and a calculating mind. "Iron, eh?" Gaines squinted at the heavy pieces Silas laid out. "Plenty of iron here, boy. Wagons break every day. This pile, it'll buy you 3 sacks of cornmeal, a bag of coffee, and maybe 2 woolen blankets. Take it or leave it. Silas knew he was being fleeced. In Boston, he would have meticulously detailed the quality of the forged steel. Here he simply nodded. The price of survival was steeper than the price of gold. He took the cornmeal and the blankets. The barracks, despite the smell of unwashed bodies and damp wool, offered a fleeting sense of security and community. For the first time in months, Silas slept on a wooden floor instead of the bare earth. He and Elijah shared their hard-won coffee with a family heading south, and Silas even spent an afternoon using his small, precious files to sharpen the tools of a kind blacksmith, earning a handful of nails in a small, sturdy iron pot. This was the communal exchange of the frontier, skills for goods, and goods for survival. During their 4-day stay, Silas encountered 2 people who would embody the dual nature of this temporary reprieve. The first was Dr. Vance, who had arrived with the tail end of the main wagon train. She was shocked to see Silas and Elsa alive. "Thorn, I thought the mountain had taken you. And the child, she is better." Dr. Vance embraced him briefly. A rare moment of affection. She examined Elsa, confirming that the worst was past, but warning Silas about the dangers ahead, particularly the scarcity of food and the increased risk of opportunistic robbery from disillusioned prospectors. She provided Silas with a small bottle of quinine, a true fortune on the trail. "You've learned to fight, Silas," she said, her eyes kind but serious. "You've replaced the mechanism of your guilt with the mechanism of your duty. But guard that child. You are walking into the country of the desperate." The desperate arrived that evening in the form of Kessler, the brutal mercenary whom Silas had encountered weeks ago, now with a new, equally rough company. Kessler had clearly abandoned his pretense of hunting and was now operating as a freelance criminal, preying on stragglers in small groups. Kessler saw Silas and Elijah immediately. He sauntered over, his eyes fixing on Elsa, then on Silas's new supplies. "Well, look at the moral clockmaker," Kessler sneered, spitting tobacco juice onto the floor. "I hear you traded a claim to a fortune for a useless little kraut. A poor trade, Thorn. You should have kept your mule and left the sentimental notions behind." "We made it through the blizzard?" "Kessler," Silas stated, standing directly between the mercenary and Elsa. He didn't reach for his gun. He stood with the quiet, rigid discipline he had learned from Elijah. Kessler laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Luck is a thief, Thorn, and luck runs out. You have food and we have guns. Maybe we'll meet again on the trail when you're weaker, and I'll collect a final toll for your foolish promise." Kessler's threat was chilling. The fleeting sense of security was violently shattered. The fort, which seemed so solid, was revealed to be a fragile island of order in a sea of lawlessness. The community was divided by a sharp line. Those who lived by cooperation, Silas, Elijah, Dr. Vance, and those who lived by predation, Kessler and his men. That night, Silas, unable to sleep, went out into the cold yard. He found Elijah cleaning his rifle, his movement slow and deliberate. "He means it, Elijah. He'll follow us. He sees Elsa as our weakness." "She is," Elijah agreed without looking up. "And your promise is your greatest weakness and your greatest strength. He knows he can starve you out or wait for the mountains to do his work for him." Silas realized that their situation was dire. They were too slow and too exposed. They needed to move quickly, but they couldn't afford a horse or another mule. He sat by the fire pit, pulling out his remaining tools, his calipers, his files, his tiny screw plate. The tools were useless for hunting or defense, yet they were the only things he possessed of true, intrinsic value. He watched the blacksmith working nearby, a huge, patient man hammering red-hot iron into a horseshoe. A sudden, intense inspiration struck him, a calculation based not on time or distance, but on value and leverage. Silas walked over to the blacksmith. "Sir, you need a new gear for your bellows. Your current one slips." The blacksmith paused, eyeing Silas skeptically. "How would a trail-worn fool like you know my gear is slipping?" "I can hear it," Silas explained. "A fault in the recoil. I can make a perfect gear for you, one that won't slip for years. I will use my last piece of brass stock, the finest in Boston. In return, I need one thing. You will forge me 20 pounds of specialized, hardened iron grapples with the sharpest possible points and a heavy, sturdy steel bar 2 feet long with a precise, tight handle." The blacksmith, intrigued by the young man's confidence and the mention of brass, agreed. For the next 2 days, Silas worked. He didn't just fix the blacksmith's bellows. He perfected them, creating a gear of such flawless precision that the mechanism ran with silent, effortless power. It was the last, most beautiful piece of clockwork he would ever create, a final, perfect sacrifice of his old identity. In return, he received the grapples and the heavy steel bar. The grapples were to be lashed to the bottom of their sledges, providing traction on the icy slopes ahead. The steel bar was his new weapon. It was too heavy for rapid fire, but perfect for a close-range, blunt force defense, a physical, unyielding representation of his resolve. As they left Fort Laramie, heading into the desolate, unforgiving country toward the Sweetwater River, Silas did not look back. He had entered a safe harbor, but only long enough to pay the price for his commitment. The glimmer of civilization had provided sustenance and a warning. It had taken his last relics of the past, his brass stock, and given him the tools for the fight ahead, the steel bar. He was ready for Kessler. He was ready for the mountains. He was ready to pay the full price of the promise he had made. He had found a community in Elijah and Dr. Vance, but he knew the true survival lay only in the fierce, unyielding new order he had built within himself. The trail from Fort Laramie to the Sweetwater River was a desolate gauntlet. Silas, Elijah, and Elsa, pulling their sledges with the newly attached iron grapples, moved with painful slowness. The grapples clawed at the frozen earth, providing traction but demanding an enormous physical toll. Their constant fear was Kessler, the threat of human predation looming larger than the mountains themselves. One bitter morning, after nearly a week of solitary travel, they crested a rise and saw a sight that felt like an intrusion upon the wilderness. A large, organized encampment, distinct from the rough clusters of pioneer wagons. This was no ordinary settlement. It was a sophisticated military-style base. Tents were pitched in precise rows. Uniformed men moved with measured efficiency, and everywhere Silas saw the tools of his past, not for measuring time, but for measuring the earth. This was the camp of a federal survey team, tasked with plotting a viable, low-altitude route for a proposed transcontinental railway, the ultimate symbol of Eastern progress, seeking to conquer the vastness of the West. The leader of the team, a man named Colonel Elias Vance, a distant relation to Dr. Vance, though their personalities were worlds apart, embodied the rigid, arrogant certainty of manifest destiny. Vance was a tall, severe man whose boots were always polished, even in the dirt. He carried a demeanor of absolute mathematical authority, seeing the entire landscape not as a living ecosystem, but as a problem to be solved with rulers and equations. Colonel Vance's mission was to lay the surveyor's line, the straightest, most efficient, most profitable path from the Mississippi to the Pacific. Silas and Elijah sought only temporary shelter and a chance to rest the child, but their arrival immediately sparked conflict. Colonel Vance approached them, his expression one of sharp professional disdain. "You are off course, citizens. This area is restricted. We are charting a federal right-of-way. Your private concerns cannot interfere with the progress of the nation." "We are simply resting, Colonel," Elijah countered, his hand resting near his knife. "The trail is public land." "Not where I lay my instruments, old man," Vance snapped, gesturing to a silver-plated theodolite, a geometric measuring tool, mounted on a tripod. "Every foot of this ground is being calculated for its use and value. And you two dragging your trash are disruptive variables." Silas, however, was drawn not to Vance's arrogance but to his instruments. The shining brass, the meticulously etched glass scales, the fine-tuned adjustments. It was the clockwork of the land. "Your precision is remarkable, Colonel," Silas said, stepping forward, "but your line appears to cut directly through the valley to the west, the place known as the Shadow Creek Gap. That land is a traditional, winter grazing ground for the Shoshone and is prone to severe flash flooding," Vance sneered. "You are a mule driver, Thorne. I am an engineer. I do not consult with sentimental fools or their superstitions. My line is based on gradients, angles, and economics. It will save the government millions and cut the travel time by half." The central conflict was immediately clear. Vance represented progress, the imposition of rigid, Eastern-defined order onto the West, prioritizing straight lines and profit over nature and history. Elijah represented nature, history, the wisdom of the old ways, the respect for the land's boundaries and the understanding that nature resists being measured or conquered. Silas stood at the divide. The former clockmaker who knew the beauty of precision, but had learned the devastating cost of ignoring the human and natural reality. The conflict escalated when Silas discovered Vance's true intent. While helping a cook, he overheard two surveyors talking. Vance's line was intentionally routed to enclose a vast, resource-rich natural spring just north of the Sweetwater. This spring was not just crucial for the Shoshone, it was the primary water source for any subsequent travelers on the Oregon Trail. Vance planned to sell the water rights to the railroad developers, effectively holding the entire future of westward migration hostage. This was no mere territorial squabble. It was the commodification of life itself. It felt like the worst of Boston's greed had successfully tracked him across the continent and was now poised to carve up the very land he sought refuge in. Silas presented his findings to Elijah. The colonel is not just drawing a line. He is drawing a boundary of ownership around the water. If he builds his railway there, the Shoshone lose their grazing ground and the settlers behind us lose their water. It's a death sentence drawn with a ruler. The pencil is mightier than the rifle when it's backed by the government, Silas, Elijah said gravely. You can't fight a federal survey. But his calculation is flawed, Silas argued, the precise logic of his old self returning with fervor. The flash flood risk in that gap is genuine. My father taught me that a mechanism built on a flawed premise will always fail. I can use his own science against him. I can prove the line is fatal. Silas needed to perform his own counter-survey, but Vance had all the tools and resources. His chance came the following day. Vance's team needed to calibrate their large, cumbersome theodolite on a high, windy ridge. Silas watched the process with the eye of a master mechanic. The theodolite, for all its grand engineering, relied on a dozen tiny, perfectly machined screws and springs, the very mechanism Silas had worked on his entire life. In the dead of night, Silas crept into the open-air storage area. He ignored the food and the weapons. He went straight to the theodolite. He didn't sabotage it by breaking it. That would simply lead to a replacement. He did something far more insidious. Using his tiny remaining set of files and screwdrivers, the ultimate sacrifice of his former trade, Silas performed a series of minute surgical adjustments. He loosened the vertical tangent screw by half a thread. He slightly altered the tension on the horizontal clamp mechanism. The changes were invisible, undetectable without a dismantling, but they were enough to introduce a calculated, precise error into every measurement taken by the instrument. The error would be small at short range, but would compound exponentially over the long distances Vance needed to survey. Instead of a perfectly straight line, Vance's final plot would show a massive, dangerous deviation, a curve that would make the route impossible for a train and put the entire project in jeopardy. It was the Clockmaker's revenge, sabotaging the principle of absolute, rigid order by introducing a tiny, perfect imperfection. The next morning, Vance's team began their crucial survey of the Shadow Creek Gap. For hours, Silas watched from a distance as Vance, oblivious, sighted through the flawed instrument, meticulously charting his disastrous course. As they prepared to leave the area and press on, Silas made one final, crucial move that solidified his opposition to Vance's progress. He walked to the perimeter of Vance's camp, where a small group of Shoshone elders had gathered, watching the survey team with quiet, desperate anxiety. Elijah had spent the time trying to communicate with them, warning them of the danger. Silas, unable to speak their language, did the only thing he could. He drew a diagram in the dirt, a perfect straight line representing the surveyor's line, cutting directly across a circle representing the water spring. Then he drew a small, crooked, looping line crossing the same spring, indicating the safer, traditional route. He then took his own small, sturdy compass, the final, perfect instrument he possessed, and carefully smashed the glass face. He handed the broken compass, its needle still trembling but its measurement obscured, to the Shoshone leader. The symbolic message was clear. The white man's straight line is flawed and dangerous. Trust your own wisdom. The Shoshone leader looked at the broken instrument, then at Silas's earnest, dirt-streaked face, and nodded slowly. He understood. Silas had given them not a weapon, but a warning backed by the very tools of his enemy. As they pulled their sledges away from the survey camp, Silas looked back. The sleek, dangerous efficiency of Vance's operation stood in stark contrast to the humble, life-sustaining nature of the Sweetwater Valley. The battle was not yet over. Vance would eventually discover the flaw, and the fight over the land would become a direct, violent confrontation. But Silas had done his part. He had used the logic of the Clockmaker to disrupt the logic of the conqueror. He had chosen the chaotic, humane path of Elijah's wisdom and Elsa's promise over the rigid, profitable order of Colonel Vance's line. He had finally and completely turned his back on the destructive precision of his past, embracing his role as a defender of the unpredictable, living chaos of the true American West. The surveyor's line was drawn, but Silas Thorne had already drawn his own line, a line in the sand, separating duty from destiny. The days following the sabotage of Colonel Vance's theodolite were marked by a terrifying silence. Silas, Elijah, and Elsa continued their slow, northward crawl along the Sweetwater, the air becoming sharper and thinner as they approached the Continental Divide at South Pass. Silas knew their pace was dangerously slow, and the enemy was no longer the climate but time itself, time for Kessler to catch up, or time for Vance to discover the fatal flaw in his perfect calculations. Elijah, sensing the imminent danger, became an almost spectral guardian. He never slept for more than 3 hours at a stretch, his eyes constantly scanning the high ridges and the winding riverbanks. His quiet vigilance was the only measure of safety they possessed. The defining moment of moral choice arrived at the base of the steep, rocky ascent leading to the pass. They found a small, sheltered meadow with good grass and a clear stream, a perfect resting spot. Too perfect, Elijah warned. It's a trap, Silas, Elijah rasped, dismounting his horse. Too much cover on the hills. Too easy a place to ambush a sledge. But we have to rest. The mule's horse is almost spent and the girl needs a few hours of sun. They set up a hasty camp, Silas immediately climbed a nearby outcrop to establish a lookout point. The heavy steel bar he had forged now feeling like a natural extension of his arm. From his vantage point, he didn't see Kessler, but he saw the signs of pursuit, a faint plume of smoke to the south, and a small fresh track in the mud, not a pioneer's boot, but the expensive, clean tread of a military shoe. Colonel Vance was on their trail. Vance wasn't coming for the mule or the gold. He was coming for the truth. The truth about why his precise, measured line had inexplicably begun to deviate wildly, threatening the collapse of his entire federal project. Silas realized his surgical act of sabotage had not stopped Vance. It had simply redirected his fury. Silas rushed back to the camp. "It's Vance, Elijah. He knows something's wrong with his equipment. He's coming for answers, and he's not alone." Before they could break camp, the situation detonated. Two things happened almost simultaneously. First, a rifle shot rang out from the woods, kicking up dust at Elijah's feet. Second, from the opposite direction, emerged Kessler and two of his men, appearing like dark ghosts from behind the tall sagebrush. The trap was sprung. Silas's moral choices, to protect Elsa, to help the Shoshone, to disrupt Vance's greed, had converged into a single, physical confrontation. They were surrounded by two distinct enemies, each driven by a different kind of vengeance. Vance's party, seeking justice for the betrayal of progress. Kessler's band seeking profit from the betrayal of humanity. The Clockmaker's lucky day, Kessler yelled, leveling his rifle. Vance is out there looking for the boy who ruined his pretty maps. And we're here to take the girl and the quinine. You're pinned, old man. Choose your poison. Elijah didn't hesitate. Silas, take Elsa, go low, follow the stream. I'll draw Kessler into the timber. He wants my horse. Don't stop until you hit the divide. What about Vance? Silas shouted, grabbing Elsa and pulling her behind the sledge. Vance is a soldier. He won't shoot a child. Go. It was the defining moment of moral choice. Silas could follow Elijah's clear command, which offered the only path to safety for Elsa. Or he could stick by his only true ally and face both enemies. The old Silas, the one motivated by guilt, might have frozen. But the new Silas, the one driven by the price of a promise, was clear. He would not leave his anchor. No, Elijah, we fight together. But not here. Silas grabbed the reins of the single horse and slashed the rope, tethering it to the sledge. Take the horse, Elijah. Use it to draw their fire away from the stream. This was Silas's move, sacrificing their final means of rapid transport, their horse, to buy time for a tactical retreat. He was trading the animal's life for the human opportunity. Elijah stared at Silas, a flicker of profound recognition passing over his weathered face. He nodded, mounted the horse, and without another word galloped away, directly toward the timber where Vance's party was presumed to be, firing a single defiant shot into the air. Kessler, assuming Elijah was fleeing with the most valuable goods, immediately shifted his pursuit. This was the deepening bond with an ally. Silas had trusted Elijah's word, that he would survive and return. And Elijah had trusted Silas's judgment, that the horse was the best sacrificial lure. Silas now had his chance. He pulled Elsa's sledge into the cover of the steep stream bank, forcing her to crawl low. Stay down, Elsa. Don't move. He drew his own weapon, the heavy, blunt steel bar. He was alone, guarding their supplies and completely exposed to Colonel Vance's men. Seconds later, Vance and 3 uniformed surveyors crashed through the high sagebrush. Vance carried a sidearm, his face contorted with cold fury. Thorne, stop the theodolite! What did you do to my instrument? Vance demanded, his voice cracking with the rage of a man whose perfect system had been irrevocably violated. Silas stood tall, the steel bar held defensively. I introduced a flaw, Colonel. Your line cuts off the Shoshone's water and it runs directly into a flood zone. I stopped a mistake that would have killed your crew and every settler who follows. You are a vandal. You have sabotaged a federal project. Vance aimed his pistol. You will tell me how to repair the mechanism now, or you will answer for treason. Silas knew he couldn't fight armed men with a steel bar, but he could talk, using the one language Vance understood, precision. You won't shoot me, Colonel, Silas said, his voice surprisingly steady, because if you shoot me, the flaw remains. That vertical tangent screw is barely holding the correct angle. It's an invisible error that will throw your coordinates off by 15 degrees when you cross the Wind River. You can't find the adjustment without my clockmaker's knowledge. Vance hesitated. Silas had hit the core of the engineer's pride and fear. He needed the line and he needed the precision. Killing Silas would mean restarting the entire survey, costing months and guaranteeing his professional ruin. At that moment, the sounds of Kessler's pursuit echoed back from the timber, a sharp burst of rifle fire followed by a yell. Kessler realized he had been tricked. Vance's attention fractured. Kessler is near. What is he to you? He's a man who wants my resources, Colonel. Just like you want my knowledge. Silas pressed his advantage. We have a common enemy, and a common problem. If Kessler takes me, he takes the only way you can fix your line. You have to choose, Colonel. Do you capture the man who exposed your error, or do you secure the knowledge you need to save your career? Vance's struggle was palpable, the clash between the rigid adherence to law and the desperate survival of his personal ambition. He had to make a choice between legal revenge and professional redemption. He lowered his pistol slightly. Tie him up, but do not harm him. He is a prisoner, not a casualty. Silas immediately felt the rough ropes bite into his wrists. He had won a temporary reprieve, a subtle victory of wit over force. As Vance's men began to secure Silas and the sledges, the true betrayal occurred. One of Vance's surveyors, a nervous, ambitious young man named Lieutenant Harrison, saw his opportunity. He quietly stepped behind Silas. You ruined the Colonel's line, Thorne, but I know the true value of your knowledge. Give me the coordinates of the Shoshone water source and I'll see you get a pardon. I made a promise, Lieutenant. Silas hissed through clenched teeth. I don't betray allies or secrets. Harrison, frustrated, kicked the sledge where Elsa lay hidden. The sound of her frightened gasp was the final breaking point. Before Harrison could raise his foot again, a massive muscular form crashed out of the timber. Elijah Cole. He had evaded Kessler, who was now chasing the decoy horse deep into the woods. Elijah didn't speak. He saw the ropes on Silas, the imminent threat to Elsa, and the betrayal in Harrison's eyes. He brought his rifle down in a wide, sweeping arc, knocking Harrison senseless. Vance and his remaining men immediately aimed their guns at Elijah. Stop, Cole, Vance commanded. You are aiding a federal prisoner. Elijah ignored him. He ran to Silas and began sawing furiously at the ropes with his knife. This is the loyalty under fire, Silas. You chose me over the horse. Now choose life over the rope. Silas's hands were free. He grabbed the heavy steel bar. Go, Elijah. Take Elsa. I will hold this pass. Elijah hesitated, then saw the fierce determination in Silas's eyes. He knew he could not waste the chance. He scooped up Elsa and sprinted toward the narrow, winding path of the pass. Silas stood alone, facing Colonel Vance and his armed men, his body an exposed shield, the steel bar his only defense. He had been captured, betrayed, and freed within minutes. The only constant was his resolve. He had paid the full price of the promise, not with gold or supplies, but with the temporary forfeiture of his own freedom, securing the escape of his allies and cementing a bond that transcended the chaos of the trail. He was ready for the consequences of his moral choice. Silas Thorne was tied to the axle of his own sledge, a humiliating and ironic end to his flight from order. Colonel Elias Vance stood over him, the meticulous fury of a betrayed engineer hardening his face. "You will tell me what you did to the theodolite." "Thorn," Vance commanded, his pistol resting on Silas's shoulder. "Tell me how to correct the angle and I will recommend clemency. Refuse, and you face the full penalty of sabotaging a federal project." Silas, exhausted and bound, looked past the colonel to the towering, snow-dusted ridges of the South Pass. He knew that even if he told Vance the truth about the tangent screw, Vance would simply fix the error and continue his disastrous, self-serving line across the Shoshone's land and the flood zone. The sacrifice he and Elijah had made would be for nothing. "The flaw is not in the machine, Colonel," Silas said, his voice raw. "It is in your intent. You built your line on greed and therefore it will always fail." Vance struck him with the butt of his pistol, a sharp, stinging blow that momentarily blurred Silas's vision. "You will not preach morality to me, Vandal. You are a pestilence on the efficiency of this nation." But before Vance could press the interrogation further, the sound of hoofbeats and the crackle of rifle fire erupted from the timber where Elijah had led Kessler. The conflict had returned, sharp and immediate. Kessler was back. He had circled the mountain, realized he had been chasing a decoy horse, and had tracked the scent of gunpowder back to the surveyor's camp. "Vance," Kessler's voice roared from the trees. "You got the Clockmaker. I want the girl and the medicine. Send him out, or we start picking off your crew." Vance, the rigid soldier, was suddenly faced with a tactical nightmare. He was pinned down by a ruthless enemy, and his valuable captive was now a liability. "Take cover," Vance bellowed, pushing his men behind the sledges and the surveying instruments. "Silas Thorn, this saves you nothing. But now you will serve as bait." The battle began in earnest. Kessler and his men, masters of rough-and-tumble ambush, poured fire into the camp. Vance's uniformed men, trained for parade ground discipline, struggled to adapt to the chaos. The air filled with the sharp zing of bullets and the shouts of the wounded. Silas, tied to the sledge, was in the worst possible position, directly in the crossfire. He strained against the ropes, the pain in his wrists forgotten in the desperate adrenaline. He watched the surveyors fall, their scientific instruments smashed and broken by the crude fury of Kessler's attack. The very symbols of Vance's ordered progress were being annihilated by the primal, self-serving greed of the frontier. Then the natural disaster struck. The sounds of the battle, the relentless gunfire, the panicked shouts, had done what neither man nor instrument could. The prolonged shattering noise triggered an avalanche high above the camp. It was not a roar, but a deep, growing rumble, a sound that started as a subterranean groan and quickly built to a thunderous, inescapable tide. Vance, who had spent his life meticulously measuring the predictable, suddenly saw the sheer, terrifying power of the unpredictable. He stared upward, his face pale, his sense of absolute control utterly shattered. "Avalanche," someone screamed. "The slope is coming down." The snow, rock, and timber descended with the crushing, overwhelming force of nature scorned. Vance and his men scattered in blind panic. Kessler's men, hardened to danger, initially held their ground, but the wall of white was too vast, too quick. Silas felt the earth shake violently. The sledge was tossed sideways. His bonds, already frayed by his struggle, snapped under the force of the seismic shock. He was free, but only to face a more terrifying death. He looked around. Colonel Vance was pinned under the massive, shattered frame of his own theodolite, the instrument of his ambition, now his tomb. Two of his surveyors were already buried. Kessler's band had been hit hard. Two were crushed. And Kessler himself was limping, his rifle lost, desperately scrambling up the far bank. This was the major turning point. The land itself had delivered the ultimate justice, annihilating both the order of the surveyor and the chaos of the predator. Silas, however, saw only the opportunity for action. He had survived the collapse of his world once. He would do it again. He grabbed the only thing he could recognize, his heavy steel bar. He saw Vance struggling, his leg trapped beneath the brass and iron of the theodolite. Vance, the man who had ordered his execution moments before, looked up at Silas with the desperate, naked plea of a dying man. This was Silas's final, silent moral choice. He could walk away, leaving Vance to the fate of his own disastrous, flawed design. He could secure his freedom and complete his promise to Elsa. No one would ever blame him. Instead, Silas rushed toward him. He didn't do it out of forgiveness, but out of the sheer unyielding duty of humanity. He was no longer running from his mother's death. He was actively choosing life over indifference, using the heavy steel bar as a lever. He pried up the shattered theodolite just enough for Vance to pull his leg free. Vance, gasping, scrambled out, his polished uniform torn and covered in snow. He looked at Silas, the hatred momentarily replaced by stunned confusion. "Why, Thorn? You had your chance." "I don't follow your line, Colonel," Silas said, dropping the bar. "I follow my own." Their momentary truce was shattered by a new threat. Kessler, having scaled the bank, saw his chance. He lunged back toward the camp, spotting Vance's abandoned pistol on the ground. "You won't live to preach, Clockmaker," Kessler screamed, grabbing the pistol and aiming at Silas. Vance, seeing the immediate danger to his rescuer, reacted instantly. The rigid soldier who valued order above life found his one moment of pure, selfless action. He tackled Kessler just as the pistol fired. The bullet went wide, but the force of Vance's blow sent Kessler tumbling back down the snowy bank. Kessler, dazed and desperate, realized the extent of his ruin. His men were gone, his reward was lost, and he was cornered between the collapse and the survivors. He looked up at Silas and Vance, a mask of pure, defeated rage, and then plunged into the churning, icy waters of the Sweetwater River, hoping to escape the final consequence of his actions. Silas, exhausted and wounded, stood beside Vance, watching the receding plume of water and snow. The echoes of conflict, the gunfire, the roar of the avalanche, the screams died away, replaced by the profound, ringing silence of the pass. Vance leaned heavily on Silas, his leg broken, his pride utterly destroyed. He looked at the shattered remains of his perfect instruments, his meticulously plotted route now buried under a mountain of chaotic debris. "The line, the whole project," Vance murmured, his voice hollow. "The land corrected your mistake, Colonel," Silas said, applying pressure to Vance's wounded leg. "Your flaw was in thinking you could conquer what you couldn't measure." Silas then did the only thing he could. He used his last piece of rope and the remnants of the sledge to fashion a crude, but effective splint for Vance's leg. He was no longer the man who built clocks. He was the man who built survival. He secured their remaining packs, their meager supplies now impossibly valuable, and began the laborious task of dragging Vance back up the slope, away from the immediate danger of the flood-prone river. As they moved toward the crest of the pass, Silas saw two figures emerge from the timber on the high ground, Elijah and Elsa. They had circled back, drawn by the sound of the avalanche, waiting for a sign. Elijah stared at Vance, draped over Silas's shoulder, and then at the utter devastation below. "You saved him, Thorn." "He saved me too," Silas replied, setting Vance down gently. "We are bound by the moment, Elijah. The chaos demanded a choice, and we chose humanity." The bond between Silas and Elijah was no longer one of convenience, but of shared, bloody sacrifice, and the fate of Colonel Vance was now inextricably linked to theirs. The conflict had not just changed the terrain, it had fundamentally changed their moral reality. Silas Thorn, the clockmaker who fled order, now carried the heavy burden of an enemy's life over the Great Divide. The journey had become a mission of salvation for both the innocent and the guilty. The climb over the South Pass was a passage into the country of the wounded, They moved with the agonizing slowness of the severely burdened. Silas, Elijah, and even 10-year-old Elsa were now caring for the man who had ordered Silas's death, Colonel Elias Vance. Vance was a dead weight, his leg fractured, his professional certainty pulverized by the avalanche, and his spirit hollowed out by the failure of his life's work. The trio fashioned a travois from the remaining axle pieces of the destroyed sledge, making a crude cradle for the colonel, who was now utterly dependent on the vandal he despised. The physical toll was immediate and immense. Silas was constantly battling exhaustion, his body battered from the fight and the fall. The heavy drag of the travois pulled at the raw sores on his hands. Every mile gained felt like a loss of a month of life. But the emotional toll was the heaviest burden. The echoes of conflict did not fade with the gunfire. They resonated in the silence of the vast cold mountains. Silas was haunted by the sight of the bodies buried beneath the avalanche. Vance's men, Kessler's thugs, all victims of the land they had tried to dominate. He kept replaying the moment of his moral choice, the second he chose to save Vance instead of leaving him to his fate. It was a victory, but it was purchased with a profound exhaustion of the soul. He felt the weight of loss for the first time, not the clinical loss of his mother years ago, but the visceral recent loss of possibility and peace. His journey had not led to freedom, but to a deeper, more demanding kind of obligation. One freezing evening, as they camped on the western slope, Silas sat by the fire, cleaning the blood and grime from the heavy steel bar, his silent weapon. Elsa, who had been unnaturally quiet since the ambush, came and sat beside him. She still clutched her wooden bird. She looked up at Silas, her eyes reflecting the small, struggling flame. "Your hands," she whispered in broken English, pointing to the raw red skin of his palms. "They are broken." "They are just sore, little one," Silas replied gently. "They will mend." Elsa shook her head. "No, the wounds on the outside heal. The wounds on the inside, they leave scars, like the wood." She turned the carved bird over, revealing a hairline fissure in the wood near its tail, a flaw Silas had never noticed. "Mama said the wound on the wood makes the carving stronger. But it stays there." Her simple wisdom struck Silas with the force of a revelation. He was covered in scars, physical and invisible. The wound of his mother's death had driven him away. The wounds of the avalanche and the ambush had defined his arrival. These wounds that won't fade were not symbols of failure, but the marks of his transformation. The moral toll was sharpest in the presence of Vance. The colonel refused to speak or eat for the first 2 days, lying rigid on the travois, staring at the vast sky with vacant eyes. His silence was a constant, corrosive accusation. Finally, during a midday rest near a desolate, wind-battered spring, Vance spoke. His voice was low and brittle. "You should have left me, Thorn. I am ruined. My survey is gone. My career's finished. I have killed men, and I attempted to have you killed. You saved a viper." Silas didn't look up from tending the fire. "I saved a man, Colonel. The viper is gone. Kessler is in the river or under the snow. Your mistake and mine was believing that a life could be defined by a straight line or a perfect tick." Vance pushed himself up, leaning on his elbow, wincing in pain. "Why are you going to Oregon? You have the skill to rebuild in California, where the money is easy. You are dragging a child and a broken man to the edge of the world for nothing." "I am going to deliver on a promise," Silas replied, his voice firm. "Her parents died looking for home. I will finish the journey for them. And you? You will come with us. You will survive, Colonel. Not because I forgive you, but because you will bear witness. You will remember what the land costs and what one life is worth. That is your new duty."